His next act was to push for war against Mexico. Admitting Texas and other states to the Union as slave states helped slavery to continue. New England and the Brahmin families depended on the South's ability to provide cheap cotton. The cotton could then be spun into textiles in New England's mills, of which Lowell was the preeminent force. When support was needed to rally certain southern states against the abolitionist movement, Cushing dispatched other New Englanders to the South. Albert Pike, from Cushing's home base in Newburyport, Massachusetts, was sent to Arkansas. He too would be raised to the 33rd degree in the Scottish Rite, and he played a key role in formation of the Ku Klux Klan. Another friend, John Quitman of New York, was sent to Mississippi, where he started Scottish Rite Freemasonry and a secessionist movement. After the war against Mexico, Cushing invited his Mexican war generals, including Jefferson Davis, to Massachusetts, where he informed them that he wanted Franklin Pierce to be president. Zachary Taylor had been the hero of the Mexican War, but had alienated the Cotton Whigs by opposing the extension of slavery into California. Nevertheless, he was elected. After 16 months in office, Taylor participated in the decidedly Masonic dedication of the obelisk known as the Washington Monument. He allegedly became sick after eating cherries and drinking milk and died shortly afterward. Again, a war hero who had survived both the travail and the rigors of war was brought down by a simple problem. Cushing still played a strong behind-the-scenes role in the 150th Lodge and the Revolution Buchanan White House, and once war became inevitable he supported Lincoln. Despite the fact that he had planted men in the South to lead the way to secession, Cushing's duplicity was never enough to keep him out of government. Stephen Girard started his career as a pilot of a French ship in the Caribbean trade. His first voyage was aboard the Pelerin Port-au-Prince in Saint-Domingue. This slave port was one of the capitals of the Triangle trade. Slaves were brought from Africa to work on the sugar plantations. Sugar was the return cargo, having been produced there for almost 200 years, when the Portuguese built many of the mills. The pilot was the man in charge of the trading, and he was often given carte blanche by the ship's owner to make a profit in any way he could. Selling the sugar to the American colonies brought higher prices, because the trade had been outlawed by the British. Girard made 6 such voyages before being promoted to captain. On his last trading voyage from France he decided he had done poorly, as commodity prices had dropped. Instead of returning to France with a less than profitable stake for his backers, he simply sold the goods and kept the money. With the ill-gotten proceeds he took on a cargo of sugar and brought it to New York. There he joined Thomas Randall in the New Orleans trade, but it was the British blockade that would finally plant Girard in Philadelphia. The city of brotherly love was especially warm toward its Masonic brothers, and Girard, who had become a Mason in Charleston, quickly joined his city's lodge. The lodge would serve as an old boys' club for merchants like John Wanamaker and ship captains like Girard. An ugly man with one bad eye, Girard married a penniless Irish maiden, Mary, at age 27. 5 months into the marriage he caught her cheating with a British colonel. His brother visited, and left him with a black concubine called Hannah, whom he would name in his will. His wife was committed. The merchants of war 151. During the Revolution the wealthy merchant and ship owner added to his fortune by acting as a privateer for the American side, while also trading with the British. Girard had taken an oath of allegiance to the colonies, but his allegiance had been first and foremost to himself. His recent trade with the British, his participation in the slave trade, and his later role in the opium trade made him the 4th richest American 14 ever. After the war Girard hired a new 18-year-old mistress. His wife, who was still in the asylum, gave birth to a daughter he never would meet. Girard's fortune grew, as he was a pioneer in the China trade. Biographer George Wilson says, he eventually derived more profits from the China trade than any of those who were in on the ground floor. 15. When the British were banned by the Chinese government from smuggling opium into the country, American ships such as Girard's took up the trade. Girard raised capital through a British banking house, Baring Brothers, to finance his entry. From both legitimate trade and smuggling Girard became one of America's richest men. During the War of 1812 he put up half of the $16 million the country needed to get through the conflict, charging his country a 10% commission. At age 77 Jared hired his fourth and last live-in maid and mistress. He lived 4 more years. His will provided generously for those who worked for him. Housekeepers, servants, and sea captains all received lifetime incomes. Jared's Masonic Lodge received $20,000. The orphans of Philadelphia received a school to house and educate them that remains to this day. Today Jared's living will is still more than $200 million. The American army marched from one defeat to another and was forced to subsist on minimal rations and without proper uniforms or even shoes. At the same time the American procurement effort was in the hands of Cushing, Jerry, Jared, and other profiteers who thought 150 to the lodge, and the revolution nothing of cheating and overcharging their own side. The British side, however, had no shortage of self-serving and inept politicians and military leaders who managed to steal defeat out of the jaws of victory on several occasions. The responsibility was then left to the French, and in particular a small circle of French aristocrats and Masons, to tip the scales. Chapter 8 The Bribe That Won the War. The story of how one French aristocrat may have been responsible for the American victory has never before been told. The American Revolutionary War is an illustrious tale of victorious moments. The first was the remarkable turning point at Saratoga, which served as the catalyst for bringing in America's potential allies. The second was the surprise crossing of the Delaware at Christmas, where the ragtag starving American army defeated the well-trained, well-equipped Hessians. The climax came at Yorktown, where the Americans and their new allies, the French, surrounded the army of General Cornwallis. Students of the war, however, see another side. They see the few victories weighing against the multiple losses of the Americans through Brooklyn, Manhattan, and White Plains, the English chasing Washington from one defeat to another, the starvation and deprivation of untrained Continentals, and their subsequent desertion and mutiny. The army of freedom fighters was half destroyed in battle, and nearly finished off by starvation and sickness, but the colonies were still populated by many who were not loyal to the new cause. Tories dominated the population of East and Long Island, where the British Army was able to buy cattle. New Jersey was mostly Tory and provided food for the English army, while Washington starved across the river in Pennsylvania. Tory landowners dominated the Carolinas, their loyalty often to their 154 the Lodge and the Revolution personal pocketbooks, which were closely tied to England. Many Americans, while loyal to the cause of liberty, still put their personal fortunes first, denying food to Washington's army and refusing the Continental as a currency. Despite the state of the economy, the constant defeats in skirmish after skirmish, and the loss of most of the American army to disease, capture, and desertion, the outcome of the war was an outstanding victory. The serious student might be led to wonder just how this was possible. There is a third side of the story that might seem even stranger. Sir William Fraser once said, "The Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton." His statement refers to the school where England's future leaders were trained. It may be valid to paraphrase Fraser when discussing how the Revolutionary War was won. The Battle of Yorktown was lost on the playing tables of London gambling house known as White's. High society in London at a time where the sun never set on Britain's empire, London society may have been at its most decadent. It was the largest city in the world, and England, of course, was the master of the ocean. While the poor starved in the streets, the upper crust of society delighted in heavy drinking, wild gambling, practical jokes, and bawdy behavior. As the world's largest port city, there could be as many as 8,000 ships in the Thames at any one time. The number of drinking houses and brothels to serve the thousands of sailors and officers was staggering. The upper classes distanced themselves from the lower classes, even in partaking of London's vices. From an establishment called Shakespeare's Head, a Covent Garden tavern popular with sea captains and directors of the British East India Company, John Harris published a list of the better prostitutes and where their services could be found.